Great, thank you. Okay, so this last topic, last one for you out of 4, right, is basically going to be a discussion of intellectual merit and broader impacts, right? So what are panelists and program managers and all of that looking for in your proposal when they ask what is the intellectual merit and the broader impacts, okay? And I know because this question's come up quite a bit in the previous sessions, that there is not a specific section now titled intellectual merit, but people still want to see what is actually the intellectual merit of your proposed project plan, even though you don't have to have a section labeled that. Okay, so as you think about doing these 2 kind of topic areas, right, now is the kind of time to set aside your whole planning, your research, all that kind of thing, and stop thinking of it as sort of, you being a researcher, a faculty member and all of that, and start thinking about it from the other side. In other words, I'm an investor, I have some money, I have a bunch of these proposals that have been pitched to me, and I have to decide where I'm going to spend my money, right? So this is really the opportunity for you to convince me, right, to spend my money for this investment, right? So you can also think of it, as having a return on investment, right? In other words, if I'm going to put my money in that, where am I going to get the biggest benefits from? So as far as a proposal is concerned, there's sort of 3 types of investors that you need to convince to invest in your project. And the first one and the closest one to you is your specific scientific community, right? So these are your colleagues that you meet at conferences, they know your technical area, they watch your presentation at a conference and they know what you're talking about. They may be your competitors that are working in your area, they're your collaborators, they kind of serve all those kind of roles, right? So you need them to see the value in your project. But they're not the only ones, right? You also need the broader scientific community, right? So these are basically people who, if you want to think about it, are sort of working in the areas specific to the NSF program, right? But they may not know the technical details of your specific research, right? So if you think about each NSF program is pretty broad, right? You have, there's obviously a general common theme there, but there's people working in all different aspects of the problem and coming at it with different backgrounds, right? So you need to not only be able to convince the value of your project to the specific people who know what, the technical details of what you're doing, but also to the broader scientific community, people who have some idea what you're doing and who are able to evaluate it, but don't have the depth necessarily to know exactly where it fits in your scientific community. And then the last group, which is just as important, is actually the taxpayers, right? And these people come in because NSF is a federal agency, right? It's basically supported by taxpayer money. And so NSF at the end of every year or whatever, I think about every year, goes to Congress and delivers a report to say, this is what we invested in. This is the science that we invested in for the country, right? And Congress wants to see the benefit of why did you choose these particular areas to invest in, right? So you've also got to think about how does your proposal benefit society? How does it benefit the taxpayers in the US? What are people actually getting out of it who may not have any understanding of the technical details of what you're doing, okay? So you need to think about all 3 of these communities as you're writing this intellectual merit and broader impacts, right? And again, this is where it's sort of separating out from writing, for example, a journal paper. Now you're taking an even bigger step back and saying, hey, if I only have a certain amount of money, why should I invest in your project? And the way that you do that is, as I mentioned earlier, kind of in writing these intellectual merit and broader impacts. Keeping in mind that the career proposal is a little bit different than a lot of the unsolicited proposals in that it has both a research and education component. So when you're thinking about these intellectual merits and broader impacts, and even the 3 communities that I listed above, think about also how your research and education is going to impact them as well. So you need to sort of view both your intellectual merits and your broader impacts with both this research and education integrated, which makes the career proposal a little bit different than most of the unsolicited proposals from that way. And finally, I'll go through some specific examples for intellectual merit and broader impact in a minute. But finally, for this slide, I cannot convince you enough that you will be much more successful if you make everyone else's job easy, right? And what I mean by that is, if I'm a panelist and I get your proposal to review and I'm excited about it and I really like it, in order for that proposal to be funded, I have to convince the other people on the panel that it's worthwhile. Okay, and so the person on the panel may not have as much technical expertise as I do in your particular area, or vice versa. They might have technical expertise that I don't have, right? But I've got to convince a broad set of people on that panel, okay, who are not all going to be experts on what you're doing, that this is the proposal to invest in. And then if your proposal is successful at the panel level and the panel's all excited about it, then if the program manager decides that they want to fund it, what do they have to do? They have to go to their boss at NSF and pitch the proposal to them, right? So you go through kind of a meeting. When I was a former program manager, you take in what you call your portfolio, right? So after a particular solicitation, here's the 10 projects I want to fund for this solicitation. Here's my portfolio. And then you have to go in and pitch to your boss that this portfolio makes sense for this research community and makes sense for the taxpayers. So they have to kind of go through that argument. And so what I'm trying to say here is, don't make these people have to go in and fish out stuff and try to find, okay, how would I argue that this is better for the taxpayers? How would I argue that there's a scientific contribution? The clearer you can put it in your proposal, the easier you make their job for them, the more likely they're going to be successful at it, right? And the more likely your proposal is going to go through those different levels and be one of the ones that's accepted in the last time. So don't expect them to fish out the benefits, right? Sometimes you'll talk to someone and they have the attitude, well, it's just obvious. If they don't get it, it's their problem. It's like, no, it's actually your problem, because you haven't made it obvious enough for them to pitch it up to the next level. Okay, so let's talk more specifically about what's actually involved in, we'll do intellectual merit first and we'll do broader impact on the next slide. Okay, so for intellectual merit, generally what happens in intellectual merits, this is a scientific contribution. So it's concepts that a person needs a knowledge of the field to understand. That doesn't mean that they have to be the world expert, but they have to kind of know at least, within your NSF program, right? Or within your engineering directorate, they have enough knowledge to say, okay, this seems like a reasonable contribution to the scientific field. So these are more the technical aspects. Again, with a career, these can be contributions to the scientific field, and also the educational aspects of teaching engineering and things like that. Okay, the key here to making a really good intellectual merit statement is everybody is excited about developing research outputs that their research group can use. Every one of you has things that you want to do for your research, okay? But again, here we're thinking about this proposal from an investment point of view. And if I read your scientific output and I'm like, that's great, and that group's going to use it, but I'm not going to use it, or my colleagues aren't going to use it, or I can't see how the field as a whole is going to use it, then it's not a good investment, right? Then there's no return on investment for the field at whole. So a really good intellectual merit statement, right, shows the contributions to the scientific field, for example, that I can look at and say, oh yeah, I know that group would like that. Oh, my colleagues over there would like to have that, right? Or maybe I know that if you went and you presented these results at a conference, there'd be a lot of different groups that would be excited about it and would want to use it and collaborate with you, or take that, algorithm or whatever you're doing and use it in their own research. That's the kind of projects that I, as a member of the scientific community, am going to be excited about investing in. And it doesn't mean that necessarily I personally myself am going to use your research results, right? Maybe I don't work in close enough a field where I'm going to be doing that, but I can see that there's a lot of people out there that would like to have that, right? And I go to conferences and I hear discussions and I know what kind of the critical barriers are that people have to overcome in the field. And if your project helps contribute to overcoming one of those critical barriers, then it's easy for me to say, oh yeah, the field of mechanics and materials would love to have this outcome. I can see a lot of people benefiting from your project. So I want to invest in it, for example, right? So panelists will be most enthusiastic about outcomes that they think that either their research group could really use, or their colleagues that they know, or just more in general. Maybe they don't have the specific people in mind, but they know a lot of people out there would really like to be able to use those outcomes. Okay. So I put together some just made up examples, right, that kind of demonstrate what I'm talking about, right? So maybe, for example, your project, a good intellectual merit would be, maybe one of the research outcomes would be that you would develop a new rapid data processing algorithm for experimental method X. Okay. Obviously, if you're running experimental method X in your laboratory, you're going to be using this data processing algorithm, right? But if a lot of people are using the similar experimental method, now if you publish this data processing algorithm, a lot of them could be using it, right? And maybe it enables now this experimental method to become a high throughput method or something like that, right? People are going to get really excited about that. So that's an intellectual merit that would come out of your research that would not just be applicable for your research group, although certainly your research group would use it, but there's a lot of other people out there that would love to have that type of data processing algorithm, for example. Now, keep in mind, as a point, if your group is the only one that has implemented experimental method XYZ, whatever that is, then the intellectual merit of the statement isn't that high, right? Because your group is going to be the only one using that processing algorithm, right? But if experimental method is something that's really widely used, like computed tomography imaging or something, right? Then that whole community is going to be super excited if they see that you've convinced them that this is a method, a processing algorithm that can do something new. It's relevant, right? It's really useful. And now I can step back and say, hey, if I fund this project, that whole community that uses this method is now going to have a new data processing algorithm. That's a big return on investment, right? Or maybe your project is going to generate a large data set on the behavior of material XYZ under extreme temperatures. So if there is a large scientific community that would like to use this material under extreme temperature conditions, great. Now they're actually going to have data sets on the behavior of this material, right? Or maybe they're going to be able to do their own experiments with the material, but they're going to be better able to design specimens because now they understand this behavior. Or maybe they do modeling of behavior, and now you're going to actually have an experimental data set that they can use to improve their models. Right? So these are ways that the scientific community would benefit from something that comes out of your project. Okay, another example might be that your project would lead to an understanding of the role process X plays in the final output of advanced manufacturing method XYZ. Right? So now we're going to, the community as a whole can work on methods to improve this advanced manufacturing method, right? Maybe it's cutting edge and really enables new structures or whatever to be manufactured, right? On the other hand, maybe people are doing other types of research and they use this advanced manufacturing method to make their specimens. And now if they can better tweak their process to produce better quality specimens because you've understood that, you've kind of enlightened them on the role that this process plays, that's a benefit that they can use in their research as well. Finally, I put one more example in here, and that was because we are talking about the career here. So, I wanted to tie in education somewhat. So one, intellectual merit related to that might be that you produce classroom support materials for teaching students topic XYZ through project-based learning, right? And if topic XYZ is something that a lot of different faculty members at different universities cover in their course, well, hey, I can immediately see the benefit that, if you publish these materials, faculty can start to use them and incorporate them in their own courses, right? So again, it's about return on investment. Okay, last slide then, I will go in and talk about broader impacts so that you kind of see how those are different than the intellectual merit, right? And so the first thing is that the broader impacts should really be impacts to two different communities, okay? There's the broader science community, much broader again than the specific technical area that you're working in. And there's society as a whole, right? So that goes back to kind of your taxpayer out there who doesn't have any clue what you're doing, but could benefit from this project as a whole. So make sure you include both of these. And again, I'll give examples from both the first category and the second category so you see what I'm talking about. Okay, so unlike the intellectual merit ones, right, generally these should be understandable to non-technical people. So as I mentioned earlier, obviously the society as a whole, you might have somebody who's not a scientist or engineer out there, but they should be able to understand that benefit that you're at least writing about in the broader impact. Okay, but then there is the broader science community as well. Okay, so again, I'll give you some specific examples. The first couple ones will be related to community number one, which was the broader science community. So a good example might be that you're going to bring the field of high performance computing into the field of XYZ, some field which hasn't really taken advantage of high performance computing, right? So maybe you work on different, computational algorithms, and you really see as part of your project, a big advancement could be that you could then introduce this field to the benefits of high performance computing, right? Meaning that you can actually now develop tools, high performance computing tools that could be used by that field, okay? So this is broader than the intellectual merit, right? This is not talking about, this is a specific algorithm that I'm developing or whatever. This is, the general kind of standing back and saying, okay, you know what, this field really doesn't take advantage of high performance computing. They don't have the needed tools or methods really that are well suited to their field. And I'm going to develop those as part of my project. And in the long term, I can see high performance computing impacting this field, right? So the intellectual merits are really things that are going to be achieved within the scope of your project. The broader impacts aren't necessarily things which are going to be achieved in the 5 years of your project, but will be enabled in the future as a result of your project, right? So I can see over the next 10 years or so that high performance computing starts to have an impact into that field. Another example for the broader science community might be something like, I'm going to increase, my project will increase the durability of material XYZ, which is critical for it to be used in the field of flexible electronics. Okay, maybe you do polymer science and material science, and you're not even working in the field of flexible electronics. You're working on how to change the properties of material XYZ, and your particular project has a lot of potential to increase the durability of that material. Okay, so the broader impact here is now the field of flexible electronics as a whole, which really needs this material for one reason or another, or pick any field you want, right? Now there might be whole new ways and structures and things they can make and new applications because they have material that has a much higher durability. Okay, so again, this is obviously broader science. You're not even working in flexible electronics, but you can see where your work is going to impact that broader science community as a whole. Okay, next couple examples are more related to the society as a whole and the taxpayer, right? So something like, in the long term, your project may enable more fuel efficient automobiles, right? That's not necessarily going to happen within the 5-year scope of your project, but in the long term, you could see that being an outcome. And hey, that's an argument that you can make to the taxpayer, and the taxpayers, yes, I would love to have that automobiles are more fuel efficient, right? Another one might be that your project would enable new treatment methods for disease XYZ, right? Another clear benefit to society as a whole. Okay, I put one more example again, tying into the educational component of the career proposal. A broader example for society might be that, the outcomes of your integration of research and education might expand the diversity in the pool of next generation engineers with expertise in artificial intelligence, for example. So as a member of society who may not have any clue about your research in, let's say it's in artificial intelligence and doesn't even really know what that is, they know from the news, from general, hearing things around that, hey, AI is really starting to affect a lot of our technology. And if you could expand the diversity of pool of engineers that we have available to work in that area, that's a great benefit to society and could have a huge economic and job benefit in the future for the US, right? So that is a selling point from a broader impact point of view. All right, so to finish off here, I just want to make the final point. Sometimes you see proposals where people get a little bit too enthusiastic about the broader impacts, and they start to claim that their proposal is going to do everything, right? It's going to end world hunger, it's going to create world peace, it's going to enable whole new energy generation thing, and that's just not, well, that's broad, it's just not that useful, right? The people reviewing these proposals are your colleagues on panels, and there needs to be a clear correlation between what you're proposing in your project and these impacts that you're talking about, okay? No one in any way expects every project to solve every problem we have in the world, right? So don't write your broader impacts as if it is, right? So you want these to be something that we're excited about. We want to see that you're excited about and that you see the impact of it. But there also needs to be a clear correlation, right? Don't make it so much of a stretch that the person just doesn't believe it and is like, okay, this is just wrong, right? So, do make it realistic, make it clear how the project itself actually connects to these impacts, and make it something believable so that your panelists will also be excited about the potential impact. Okay, so with that said, I think I am done here. So I will jump out of here and let people work on questions, and then we will take questions at the end of the session. Okay, great. Yeah, I'll take a look at some of these questions. Okay. Yeah, so one of them here, for example, 35. Do you have any suggestions on how to make complex research topics simplified for outreach activities or to the general public, right? And I think that I can see where that question is coming from, but what we're talking about here, for example, is the impact of the work, right? Which is a little bit different than what the actual activities are, right? So the impact of the work may not be related, for example, to actually outreach that you do, but it's more the what do you hope to gain from that, and what do you think the long-term impacts of that would be. So there's a little bit different, I think, perspective here than what that question is actually asking. Number 38, should we mention our career vision in the intellectual merit or broader impact? I don't know that fits really well. I always say there's not one formula as to how to write a proposal. I would see that it would be difficult to, if you really want to make this section succinct and you want to make it to the point, you may mention your career vision, but I would try not to muddle it too much with other things. Number 37, what are key factors that the reviewers are looking for in the broader impacts? Keywords to see? Well, there's not keywords, right? Again, there's not one way to write the proposal. And this is very similar to the next one I'm going to talk about, I think, is that people are really they want to see originality. They want to see, what do you come up with? That's the whole thing, right? They want to see, why are you excited about doing this research, right? Is it just is it you're really not thinking about how this is going to impact other people, or have you actually thought about it, right? So there's no key buzzwords that people are looking for. They're looking for enthusiasm from you, and they're looking for you being able to have a vision for why this research is important. And I think that kind of ties into number 40 here, which says, I submitted a proposal before, and some of the broader impacts were related to research in STEM education at my HBCU university. However, I got a comment from reviewers that these are standard things that shouldn't be considered as broader impacts. Can you elaborate on how reviewers perceive the RI and STEM for underrepresented student body? Yeah, I can see, and I've seen panels kind of react to this, and maybe I'll explain a little bit on what I've seen with panels. It's not that these things don't have potential impact and that the potential impact is important. I think panels see that. I think what they're really telling you is that these things sound very boilerplate, meaning that the way that you've written it didn't necessarily show your enthusiasm for it or what you were going to do that's unique or whatever. So if you just say, I'm in a HBCU and therefore me teaching this course, I have no idea what to put in here, right? But if I just said me teaching this course is going to impact minority students because I'm at a HBCU, there's nothing really kind of original or what makes you kind of stand out compared to other faculty at HBCUs, for example. there's a lot of potential there, right? And minority and female students and reaching underrepresented groups are very important to the panels. I think really the message that's being communicated here is they're not seeing your enthusiasm and they're not seeing your creativity come into the process. You mentioned the intellectual merit section is no longer needed. Can you elaborate on this? This is what I'm saying is just, I've had several comments that in the latest solicitation says that you do not have to have a section which is specifically titled intellectual merit. That's all it is. So it doesn't mean that that content shouldn't be in there. All I meant was that you don't have to have a section specifically labeled as that. Okay, how long should the broader impact and intellectual merit be if reviewers expect to see it based on number of pages and won't say it was short? I saw numbers varied between 1 to 5 pages. And again, there is not a formula for the perfect proposal, right? You should talk about the impact of your work early in the proposal so that a person doesn't have to wait to get to the last page in the proposal to see why they should even be interested in funding it, right? If you capture their attention right away and say, hey, look, here's the impact, keep reading and I'll explain how I get you that, then the reader is going to be much more interested. So put it early on, but I don't think there's a specific size or page, page numbers that should be in there. Okay, number 47 is actually interesting, right? So, and I've seen this before too, right? Assessment for the broader impact of society is fundamentally hard, which is true. Particularly if something like enabling possible treatments for XYZ would be hard to assess. How can we do it? And this is very important, right? So when we talk about intellectual merit, right, that should be something that's achieved within the 5 years of your project. When you talk about something like broader impacts, there's not the expectation that that's going to be achieved by the time that your career project is over. So there's not the expectation that you're going to actually assess that by the end of the project, right? So there is some assessment, for example, when you go career plans and the educational plans, right? And there'll be specific goals that you have in the project, which you will be able to assess. But when we're talking about longer, broader impact type things, those can't be assessed within the 5 years of the project because often that impact doesn't occur until years out after the project. So there's not an expectation that you're going to assess that long-term broader impact from that way. Okay, number 45. In biomedical applications, how much broader impact can you discuss in clinical applications before you hit NIH territory? And that's a reasonable question, right? And it's a reasonable question, okay? But it's kind of asking the wrong question. So that's what makes it so important, right? So when you decide what's NIH territory and what's NSF territory, okay, it's not really the broader impacts. They both have very similar broader impacts, right? Some projects, right? So there's projects at NIH that perhaps want to, like I said, provide better treatment methods for disease X. And there's some projects at NSF that have that same broader impact from that way. The difference between is a proposal more suitable for NIH or NSF is in the actual research plan, the research objectives, and perhaps a little bit more in the intellectual merit, right? So NSF and NIH have very different goals in terms of the very specific research objectives. So I wouldn't worry about broader impact overlapping between those two agencies because, hey, I mean, NSF in terms of broader impact overlaps with a lot of other agencies, like DOE, right? A lot of energy issues, problems that DOE are trying to solve also might be long-term impacts of NSF. So NSF is a little bit more basic science, earlier science than something like DOE, but the long-term broader impact of a DOE project might be very similar to that of NSF. So similar thing here with the NIH. Let's see, if I am developing technical knowledge, not new equipment or applied technology that can be used to explain phenomena and advance knowledge in other fields, is that an intellectual merit or a broader impact? So that's probably, depending on how you kind of phrase it, that's probably an intellectual merit. the actually technology in the long term that it would enable, not necessarily that you're developing in your project, but the long-term technology that it would enable, that would be a broader impact, for example. Okay, what do we got up here? While it would be great to achieve lots with the proposal, if the work is more impactful than it is novel, or more novel than it is impact, where or how might you indicate that in the IM or the BI? Well, unfortunately, I think the answer to that question is NSF funds research that is novel and likely to have a high impact. So you really need to be high in both of those categories. So if you're weak in one of those areas, that's going to make your proposal not as competitive in the panel. So I don't think you want to emphasize it being higher in one way or the other. You really need to meet both criteria. All right, what else have we got here? Should we maybe follow the students who has been in our outreach activities over years and see if they prefer STEM fields, etc., to assess the broader impact? Will it require IRB and would it be effective? I think really there you have to think about length, right? The career proposal is 5 years. And if you're going to follow students, you know, who've actually been through the activities and go there, I think more importantly, before you get into the nitty gritty of, you know, how would you actually do that and go through the assessment, think about, hey, is this assessment something that's actually going to be done within the project timeline? And am I actually going to be able to do, you know, am I actually going to be evaluating the results of that assessment within the project? So this might be something that quickly kind of puts you out of the scope of your five-year project. How are the broader impacts different from the integration of research and education portion? Well, the integration of research and education portion is a plan. How are you actually going to do it? Why are you doing it? What kind of educational research supports the idea that this integration, you know, makes sense, right? How are you going to do it? Why are you going to do it? You know, those kind of things are what you put in the integration plan. The broader impacts is different, right? It's what you hope in the long term would come out if your integration plan is successful. What do you hope would be the long-term impacts from that way? So there, it's a different section in that way.